Friends, Americans, patriots, lend me your ears. It is May 3rd, 2026. My name is Mitchell Knight. This is a semi-quincentennial dispatch. It is the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America, and as a patriotic American citizen, I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to keep that in mind, to be engaged civically, right? To renew a 21st century version of civics, responsible democratic politics here in the United States that serves the interests of all citizens, regardless of wealth, ethnicity, religious affiliation, whatnot, right? Liberalism, which is defined as the belief, liberalism is the belief that individual rights are the foundation of a free society, right? So that's liberalism. So anybody who tells you they're not a liberal, fuck that. You're not a patriot then. The U.S. Constitution is very much the most liberal constitution in the world, from the sense that it is providing individual rights. So despite the fact that it is the 250th anniversary of the founding of these United States of America, the current administration, all run by Republicans, from the presidency to the House of Representatives to the Senate to the Supreme Court, we have unified Republican control of the federal government, and yet you hear nothing, right? There is no attempt to create a celebration, a national celebration of our birthday. It is the 250th anniversary this year of our founding, and that anniversary doesn't start on July 4th, right? It is a rolling anniversary. It started years ago, right? Because 2025 was the 250th anniversary of 1775, which was a fairly important year in American history worth celebrating too. It was the year that the Army was founded, right? It was the year that Continental Congress really understood what they were about to get into, the revolution that they were setting off, right? And yet this generation of Republicans could really give two shits about memorializing the greatness of our American Revolution, the thing that makes the United States great, which was the liberation of individuals from the tyranny of autocratic, theocratic forms of government for democracy. It was an imperfect start, but we've been perfecting it along the way. Now, just because we've been perfecting it along the way doesn't mean that we've gotten it right still. And last week's decision by the Supreme Court, by the John Roberts Supreme Court, in a majority opinion written by Samuel Alito, who was a lot of axes to grind and does so very openly, further eroded the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And it really should not be lost on any American citizen that an all-white conservative majority has determined by themselves that matters of race no longer apply politically in the United States. And for as nice as it would be to have colorblind policies, simply because race doesn't exist, it's not a biological fact. In fact, biologically, there's every evidence in the world that race is a completely imaginary thing. Despite the fact that is the case, that is the objective reality, that race is a completely fake bullshit, that does not change the fact that racial perception helps to organize and advantage society in some cases and disadvantage society in others based on this fake notion of race, right? And so on, Wednesday or Thursday, when the Supreme Court made their decision, it really flew in the face of logic based on what the decision was saying. But to really get to the logic, we really have to go back to the beginning, right? Because I don't think most Americans are very cognizant about our deepest, earliest history. And I think for every patriot to feel patriotic about this country, we have to look at it, warts and all. All right. And so the fact is, in 1776, the Deep South colonies, right, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, were not white majority, right? They were 50-50. It was 50% African American, enslaved African American, or even just whatever. And 50%, in some cases, even something like 48%. So an actual minority of white people, or described as white people. So from the very beginning, from the very foundations of our history, the notion of a white majority has persisted. It is assumed by liberals and conservatives, by white people, black people, Hispanics, Asians, by everybody, that a white majority has existed. Throughout, or is the norm, right? It is assumed that a white majority is the norm, and that is the body through which politics should be driven, right? It's an absurd notion, because again, the notion that the Deep South was white majority is a fairly recent fantasy, right? But that doesn't mean that people's beliefs didn't inform how the laws were written. And, well, let's put it this way. Before the Revolutionary War started, the northern colonies were really at odds to whether or not to invite the southern colonies to join them in their rebellion against the king, right? Because the idea that they were going to start a new country founded on individual freedom while allowing enslavers on a mass scale into their political project was a hypocrisy that even slave-owning Thomas Jefferson himself was like, this is so fucking insane. Like, it was necessity was the mother of invention. We dragged and cajoled the southern aristocratic class to come and support us. The aristocrats, I mean, they're yeoman farmers, the just working class whites of the South did disproportionately, they were patriotic revolutionaries. It was the aristocratic slave-owning class that was the most reluctant to go along with, abiding by a government that said all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which human enslavement deprives, full stop, right? And that was an economically devastating philosophy to hold for aristocratic slave owners. So yes, even in the 1770s, there was this tension between democratizing forces in the United States, or what would become the United States, and aristocratic, anti-democratic forces, right? Aristocracy, oligarchy, the monopolization of power, to the point of the idea of owning a human being was somehow an acceptable practice in society. Now, it wasn't all because the northern colonists were altruistic, anti-racist, that they didn't want to invite the South. They also understood that in the South, there was not a white majority, right? One of the reasons that some, not all, but some of the original northern revolutionary American patriots were reluctant is they themselves were racist and did not want to invite individuals of African descent into their new project too. But because necessity, right, because of the necessity of defeating the British Navy was so high, the necessity of having ports across the Atlantic seaboard, the northern colonists made compromises, and they were called compromises at the time, that I don't think they made with a good taste in their mouth, right? The most famous being the 3/5 compromise, you know, to neuter the very real fact that if not an outright majority of Southern Americans were African American, then at least about 50% of them were, to dilute any political power that they were to hold in this new republic. The Southern aristocratic representatives insisted that Black Americans were 3/5 of a human being. What a fucked up thing to think, right? Now, again, this notion did not sit well with all of the Northern revolutionaries. They really did understand the hypocrisy. Even the fact that in Pennsylvania, even in Massachusetts until after the Revolution, in New York State, in Delaware, slavery was still legal. It was still on the books. It was not practiced at the scale that it was throughout the South. Human enslavement in the United States was always predicated on race, on racial discrimination, right? Like, a white Southern aristocrat did not have the right to enslave even the poorest, most yokel white person because of the color of their skin. It was a racially designed system. Now, that system was understood to be poison within the body politic, or a cancer within the body politic, that the original founders understood that at some point was going to need to be addressed, but they, compromising the fact that they could snatch defeat from the jaws of victory if they really held their, principled stance that all men are created equal. And, by letting another generation take care of the problem of human enslavement that they knew was a problem, it was cowardly. Was it calculated? Was it the right decision? That's hard to say, because, the fact is, we don't have human enslavement. We do have human enslavement. It's usually in the form of sex slavery. It's targeted mostly to young women. It's a global problem. So human enslavement still exists, but the kind of chattel slavery that existed throughout the southern United States, obviously we've done away with that, thank God. But because the South had the largest concentration of African Americans, because of the system of slavery that they were thrown into by no choice of their own, they were literally kidnapped and shipped across the Atlantic in just fucking god-awful conditions, and just worked to death. I was gonna say work to death like horses, but who the fuck would work a horse to death? What responsible farmer treats his livestock the same way that slave owners treated their enslaved people, right? And if they did, these people truly are psychopathic morons, which they were. But yeah, because the South had the largest concentration of African Americans in the Union, and the pressures of slavery throughout the first 70, 80 years of the Republic's existence, the pressures grew and grew and grew, right? There were efforts to expand slavery throughout the West. There were efforts to limit slavery. Almost immediately after the Revolution, the northern colonies that had statutes on the books that allowed for human enslavement started getting rid of it. They started realizing what the hypocrisy was, and that there was no benefit to society whatsoever to practice human enslavement, especially a society that was predicated on the principle of individual liberty, which is liberalism. So because this problem got put on pause for 80 years, it became a pressure cooker, right? The South was getting tremendously wealthy off of human enslavement. The North was reaping the rewards of artificially inexpensive goods coming up north, like cotton, right? They were just paying an artificially low price for cotton to manufacture up into clothing up north. that they would have paid a little bit more if, you know, instead of slaves, the plantations employed employees, right, who have rights and wages. So the boiling point comes, obviously, in the 1850s. Well, really, with the 1850 fugitive slave law, which in essence coerced northern states to administer the property rights of southern aristocrats. You know, so what they were saying was, it's illegal for Ohio to turn a blind eye to escaped slaves because those individuals are the property of somebody who lives in Alabama or somebody who lives in Kentucky or whatever. Actually, I think Kentucky might have been a free state. But yeah, so the fugitive slave law was, in essence, this attempt to compel patriotic Americans. I mean, not just in the North, there were patriotic Americans in the South who opposed human enslavement. There were white patriotic Americans in the South who opposed human enslavement. There are actually a very significant number, because during the Civil War, you can look at the rates of Confederate to Union soldiers, right? Like volunteers. Like, the Confederate Army lost in part because people did not want to fight for that fucking cause. Right? There were plenty who did, but they had manpower shortages from the not from the get-go, because they did have this like initial burst of energy at the beginning, but by the time, you know, the war started dragging on, desertions were really affecting the Confederacy. I mean, they affected the Union too, but more so the Confederacy. It is hard to convince people to die for the cause of human enslavement. Yeah, and so in the 1850s, there's this law that is foisted upon patriotic Americans who believe that individuals should be free to live their lives as they like, right? They're coerced into participating in a system of human enslavement that they do not believe in. They reject. They are so sick and tired of their country being stained with the blood of human beings who do not deserve to be treated the way that they were being treated, to the point that they took up arms and fucking started killing each other over it, right? That's what the Civil War was. And the abolitionists leading the cause of individual freedom, the abolitionists leading the fight against human enslavement, was the newly formed Republican Party. Now, this was an explicitly abolitionist party based on the notion that all Americans, regardless of their race, were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, were entitled to civil rights, right? This is the era when civil rights starts becoming a real buzzword politically. So 1860s, obviously the Union wins the war, right? President Lincoln emancipates Southern slaves, in essence saying the federal government no longer recognizes the practice and will not enforce it, and that every slave in the South is now free. They, you know, how to effectuate their freedom is a difficult thing, but that's the position of the United States of America. That is, right? That is us. That is the United States of America saving its soul, right? That is a part of our greatness. That's why it's important that you don't ignore the fact that slavery happened in the name of the United States. You remember it, because that's part of the process of our greatness. We overcome this shit. But obviously, an assassin took President Lincoln's life, leaving the United States run by a man named, Jesus Christ, Andrew Johnson. I just immediately started blanking on it. Andrew Johnson was a compromise. Again, the 19th century American history is defined by compromise, and it's always terrible. It's always bad. The Missouri Compromise, the compromise Abraham Lincoln took to win his second election, right? He needed Andrew Johnson, who was himself a Southern aristocratic Democrat, who was a little softer on the issue of human enslavement. He was still a raging racist, but he was a sop, right? He was a sop to not quite Confederates. You know, think of these as like those squishy independents who are actually conservative but will not align themselves with the conservative party because they're kind of pussies, right? He was a sop to that group to really coalesce a pro-freedom majority. Not, you know, and Abraham Lincoln was not expecting dude to get shot. Now that's an oversight of his, because it left the country in the hands of Andrew Johnson, who was by far more racist, far more sympathetic to the Confederate cause than even his adversaries at the time understood, because Andrew Johnson, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, all of a sudden the South, which is, again, a 50-50 split, there's no majority, there's not a real majority between whites or blacks whatsoever, meaning about 50% of political power should be going to blacks, 50% should be going to whites, right? Obviously, until the Civil War, Black Americans in the South were deprived of the right to vote, the right to hold political office, the right to fucking read a book, the right to just move between properties, right? Like, they didn't have the freedom to travel. They had to have permission to travel from like one place to another, like just to go from one town to another, or else they could be arrested or killed. And so, of course, in the aftermath of the victory, the Union victory, of course, Black Americans and white Americans in droves started electing Black Americans to political office. There were Black mayors, Black governors, well, not, I don't think there were Black governors, but there were Black Congress people. There were women. There were women in power, in places of power. There were Black women being elected to offices. There was a brief moment of democratic expansion that President Johnson stifled, right? He just couldn't live with it. He couldn't grant the Confederacy its victory, but he could do everything to stymie the Union victory. And so he turned a blind eye. So as the Black Southerners are gaining political power and finding dignity in their democratic roles as citizens for the first time in the United States, a wave of terror starts to hit the United States, especially the southern United States, enacted by veteran Confederates who are now without a cause, right? These are people who've been trained in the arts of war. They've been trained in weaponry. They've been trained in violence. They've been trained to be inoculated to violence and suffering, right? And so without their cause, they're set free in society. There's a very lax attitude to not prosecute the formerly Confederate in an effort to, you know, go along to get along. But that effort to not prosecute Confederates, combined with these whites left loose, you know, angry whites left loose in society watching African Americans gain political power, the idea that they would ever have to live under like a Black mayor was so upsetting to them that they start going on a violent rampage. So these veteran groups start to organize, right? These aristocratic / veteran groups. One of them is the KKK. That has been the most persistent throughout American history. That's the one that these groups love to just go back to, is the KKK. They weren't the only ones. There was the White Man's League, right? That's pretty obvious. There's the Knights of White Camellia, which is more, right? If the KKK is sort of the good old boys, the Knights of the White Camellia is like the aristocrats. These are like the corporate Republicans who will let like Patriot Front do their dirty work, but are actually sitting back, you know, counting their millions. So Knights of the White Camellia, the White Citizens League, the red shirts. There's something about the color red in politics that signals aggression. There are all these terroristic groups, and I'm using that term very carefully because this is the word that was used in the 1860s and 70s. So these groups go around seeing African Americans achieve all sorts of political victories, and what they do is they start murdering people, kidnapping people, setting fire to city halls, to houses, to churches. They do everything in their power. They show up on election day with guns surrounding black citizens to intimidate them to vote. Sometimes they would just shoot them shoot them in line so the other citizens would just leave and dissipate. In essence, they deprived American citizens of their civil rights, their rights to be involved in the political process. And so this wave of terrorism after the Civil War is so galvanizing to the North that Andrew Johnson is, he's impeached. He's the first president to be impeached. He scrapes through conviction, and he is, out of office completely as a afterthought, as a regretful afterthought. And in his stead is elected Republican Ulysses S. Grant, war hero of the Civil War, right? Union general, war hero. And he takes the problem of the Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens League, the red shirts, the Knights of the White Camellia. He takes this problem of political terrorism, which is the word that they were using at the time, and he rallies the radical Republicans, which is a multiracial, right? A multiracial coalition in Congress of newly emancipated and formerly enslaved individuals, and then, lots of Northern Republicans, and just lots of, Americans who didn't support the Confederacy, but, were still independent. Not independent of the Union, but just weren't Republicans. There were other political parties at the time. But under President Ulysses S. Grant, there was a huge rally around because of the extraordinary violence that was making its way into Northern newspapers, into Western newspapers. The violence in the South was not lost on the rest of the country. And so Ulysses S. Grant, with the help of the radical Republicans in Congress, passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution, ensuring the right to vote, ensuring civil rights that bypass somebody's race, ethnicity, origin, religion. Protected classes, right? That's the term of art that we use nowadays. So protected classes. That was in the 1870s, that those protected classes were explicitly protected in law. Right? So these are not new woke concepts. These are concepts that go well over a century and a half into our history. And so another effort that was made to ensure that the newly citizened African Americans were able to participate in the political process, President Grant formed the Department of Justice, and its signal mission was to fight domestic terrorism. That was literally its founding charter, was to fight domestic terrorism, because these groups were considered domestic terrorists. They were using violence to enact a political cause. That's the definition of terrorism, using violence against citizens to further a political cause. That's terrorism. Right? And so the KKK, the Knights, all those people, political terrorists. Now, over the course of President Grant's 2 terms, economics, of course, sidelined racial progress, as it usually does in U.S. history, unfortunately. And while he was extremely successful in rooting out a lot of these groups, there were still little seeds of them. Obviously, you've still heard of the Ku Klux Klan, right? So it wasn't entirely successful. But now we're entering into the Jim Crow era, right? This is the post-Reformation, Reconstruction to civil rights era of U.S., it's about 100-year history, a century, 1865 to 1965, we can think about. The Jim Crow era, right? And so, because the South, again, not majority white, but with a lot of white people who believe in the notion of white supremacy, and this is about the time when that term really comes into political valence. Again, not from the enemies, not from the woke left. These were the words used by the KKK. They wanted white supremacy. You can find these phrases being published and used throughout newspapers in the 19th century, not as a term of a pejorative term, but as a term of like endearment, of rallying around my cause is white supremacy. I support white supremacy. I shouldn't say that. That could be taken out of context. But yes, so the threat that non-aristocratic white voters might find alliance, like yeoman farmers might find alliance with the newly freed African Americans, right, and form a political coalition, was a real threat to these Southern aristocrats who did not want to cede their power, right? And so they racialized their political power, despite the fact that they were holding more, just as many white people out of political office as they were black people. But it led to just decades of violence. And so after the Civil War, you see this huge increase of political participation in black from African Americans. And then immediately there's just this drop. And for over a century, the South has, in essence, no political representation whatsoever from anybody who's black. Despite the fact that we're talking about societies that are 50-50 splits. There is no clear majority one way or the other, right? And so, and yet, it is race that is keeping a certain segment of the population out. The white supremacist movements that was heralded from 1865 until 1965 and beyond, but like the notion of white supremacy racialized or continued to racialize American politics in ways that were unnecessary. But we do live with this reality, right? And so, since the Civil War, we've had these periods of just these spiking periods of racial violence and animosity and attempts to deprive people of their rights to vote. And then we have these periods of kind of progress / like toning down, right? And so you see in the 1860s to 1880s, there's this big spike of violence. Then it kind of tones down. It's not like the violence went away, but it tones down a little bit because the white people are effective at intimidating black people out of their rights, right? And so as that intimidation works, for a generation, right? It's not until the 1920s, right? And you start to see a renaissance, right? A literary renaissance in black American culture. Harlem Renaissance. It's not just Harlem. It's entirely across the country that African Americans were being educating themselves because they had to at rates that were just unseen, that they would not have been able to achieve in prior generations. And so in the 1920s, you start to see a new generation of African Americans demanding their civil rights. This is when the NAACP is formed. You can see the formation of black thought, right? Of American black thought as a unique feature of American culture really start to take shape. And it's indignifying. Again, I know white people are like self-identified white conservatives flip out about this shit as if it fucking matters, as if they don't have the place in 2026 to choose the right side, right? Nobody should be intimidated about the positions that their great-great-grandparents took, right? Because you don't have to take their position. You don't have to defend that shit. Anyway, from the 1920s, there's, again, this massive spike of nationalistic violence, these attempts to deprive black people of the right to vote, because, again, black people, are having this generational moment, this generational growing awareness of what their rights, the deprivation that they're experiencing. Not that previous black generations didn't know it, it's just that communication through media is becoming more efficient in the 1920s. Anyway, this is so long-winded. If you're still watching, I appreciate this. All right, let me think. Where is that? Okay, so yeah, in the 1920s, you see the second generation of the Ku Klux Klan come. So in the 1860s, 1870s, you have this first wave of the Ku Klux Klan. It kind of dies down, it goes in the back burner. And then in the 1910s to 1920s, you really start to see a push, right? So if there's a generational awakening in the black community, there's also a generational awakening in the grievance white community, right? And they start to, these are the children and the grandchildren of the Confederates, right? And they start to have this moment of like, this butthurtness about losing the war, losing their place in society, losing things that they're not losing just because other people are gaining, right? Losing the right to own human beings as property, or to treat them as second-class citizens based on the color of their skin and not the content of their character, right? So yeah, you see this, and actually, interesting fact, the first time a Trump made the national news for a scandal that he was involved with was Frederick Trump, Donald Trump's father, who was involved in a clash between the Ku Klux Klan and Italian fascists and some anti-fascists in, I think it was Brooklyn, it might have been Queens. I know he lived in Queens. Well, again, I don't remember which borough it was in. I think it was Queens, actually. I think it was Queens because I think there was issues with the Queens chief of police about whether he would prosecute the KKK members for their violence that they instigated. But anyway, the first time a Trump made the New York Times for his abhorrent behavior was in 1925 when Frederick Trump was a part of a KKK mob attack against other political groups that they disagreed with. The irony being some of them were fascists, whom they would later align themselves with. But you see, again, you see a diminution somewhat of the violence, not that it ever goes away, but as the Great Depression transitions the United States, transitions us away from these inward-looking national politics to necessitating a more outward, right? You have to confront the threat of fascism in the 1930s and the 1940s, and immediately it becomes evident to anti-fascists in the United States that Adolf Hitler, right, is using racialized hatred to advance the cause. And so the people who want to fight, when I say anti-fascist, I don't mean Antifa, I mean people who are against fascism. That's the definition of Antifa, anti-fascists. And so that would include conservative Americans like Dwight D. Eisenhower and General MacArthur, right? So in the 1930s, 1940s, you really start to see a national push to kind of address the racial tensions in the United States at the national level. FDR did not go far enough. Again, compromise got in the way of ambition, right? I do genuinely think that FDR was a far more egalitarian person than his aristocratic upbringing would have you believe. But I do think that he was earnest in his desire to fully integrate the federal workforce and the military. But the fact that he couldn't achieve it is not so much his fault as the fact that just there were unreconstructed Americans who were offended at the notion that African Americans might bring as much, if not more, value to the fight against fascism than white Americans were. Which led to a national movement, propaganda, right, of, hey, we got to get over these race, to be an American means I don't care what your race, creed, or background is, we're all Americans. We got to overlook these parochial bullshit little interests, right? But that doesn't mean that political power is returning to, again, the half of the southern United States who's African American. They're still being deprived, right? But just like their parents in the 1910s and the 1920s, African Americans in the 1940s, 1950s, and the 1960s really just had enough, right? They started taking advantage of a new media technology, the television, the moving pictures, television, film, to really show the rest of the country, which had seen these incidents of violence before, but the more you can see it with your own eyes, unmediated through words, right, through images instead of just descriptions in a newspaper, for the wave of violence that was being enacted against Black people throughout the South. And we often summarize that as, the assassination of Martin Luther King, of Malcolm X, of Medgar Evers, right? But those three deaths are just, they're not the tip of the iceberg. They're the tip of 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 the iceberg, right? There was, I believe, a lynching every other day from 1870 to 1925 of a Black person every other day, right? So for about 50 years, right? Every other day, a Black person is being lynched in the United States. In the 1950s, once again, just like in the 1920s, you have this resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. It's this time, if it was the grandchildren of the Confederacy, now it's the great-great-grandchildren of the Confederacy reappropriating that hood, right? Grabbing the hood and putting it back on. Firebombing churches across Georgia. Murdering children. Just setting bombs in the homes of political leaders, of pastors, right? Of Black families, of Black middle-class families. Just imagine going to your suburban house and having some fucking psychopath put a fucking bomb in your basement and it blows up you and your children. This was happening throughout the South to Black people for a long time. Political power throughout the South was held in the hands of white supremacists, people who believed that they had the inherent right to monopolize all political power in the southern United States, despite the fact that they were minority, right? White supremacists, by definition, were minority. They were keeping Blacks out, which were half the population. They were also keeping, whatever that undefined opposition, 20% of white people in the South who did not agree with them. That makes up a majority of Southerners who were locked out of Southern politics. And the use of violence was an explicit and purposeful way to deprive African Americans explicitly of their right to vote, their right to participate in our politics, the right to be free citizens in a free society, free from the threat of violence, because nobody should be subjected to that, and it got to the point where the violence was so bad and so terrifying, genuinely terrifying, that it did actually unite conservatives and liberals, by which I mean moderate conservatives, obviously not reactionary conservatives, in the 1950s and the 1960s to rally around the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a series of tests, right? Because for over a century, supposedly enfranchised African Americans had been deprived of the right to vote, the right to run for office. So having a century's worth of information at their disposal, lawmakers set up certain tests to be like, hey, are you putting undue burdens in front of citizens, depriving them of voting, whether that's forcing them to take literacy tests, forcing them to pay poll taxes, forcing them to, not even literacy tests, just nonsensical tests that didn't actually, I mean, it's insane. I don't know if they still teach this part of history in high school civics class or social studies, but yeah, like the kind of shit that white people would put black people through just to, there's also a form of just social humiliation that was imposed on black people for a century and more. That's why white racists really like smiling black people and get offended by angry black people, even if the black person's not actually angry, they're just expressing themselves in a seemingly aggressive way, right? Like Kendrick Lamar can say the most happy shit in the world, but a white racist is going to hear that as an angry black person, whereas Tim Scott can go and tell them with a smile that their gas prices are being lowered, when in fact their gas prices are going up at a faster rate right now than has ever happened in American history. That's a tangent. That's an aside. But yeah, so that Voting Rights Act of 1965 set up a special set of tests to determine whether or not the states in the Deep South were depriving people of the right to vote. It wasn't a coincidence that it was the Deep South that was chosen or that was targeted by these tests, because it was demonstrably true that it was the Deep South systematically protecting white supremacists, not allowing them to monopolize power, allowing them to commit acts of violence without the fear of being punished for it. And since then, right, we've had freer elections. We have had, let's see, so about 60 years since 1965 of a gradual reduction in the kind of violence and animosity. Not that it has gone away at all, but we've seen the kind of a gradual reduction in the violence, and we've seen more and more African Americans, Hispanic, Latino, Asian representation in political office and political power and as voting blocs, right? And that's a wonderful thing, obviously. However, that does not mean that racial animus does not drive political processes within the United States to this day. And so in Justice Alito's justification as to why it's acceptable to neuter the Voting Rights Act right now, specifically the tests used by Congress to determine whether or not a state is disenfranchising citizens of their civil rights, why it's disingenuous. Well, Samuel Alito is going off the premise that we are now beyond race, right? Like American society, by having made progress, is actually now free of being like we are no longer racist. And part of his evidence for that is that, or part of the justification is that he thinks that gerrymandering based on race is wrong, which, I mean, I agree with that, right? But gerrymandering that happens to be racially disproportionately affecting individuals of a certain race, disproportionately affecting communities and depriving them of representation in Congress and in City Hall in their respective political fora. He's saying that so long as it's a partisan effort and not an explicitly racial effort, then that is what is occurring, right, in the 21st century. Not like in the 19th and the 20th century when you had explicitly white supremacist, racialized politicking. Now he's saying, look, yes, conservatives throughout American history have tended to use race as the motivating factor to keep certain people out of political power, but now it's more just partisanship. And so part of his opinion, he said that, like, yes, you can still, like, look at race to see if that's, like, being disproportionately being affected by these gerrymanders, but you have to prove that there is a racial component to the political outcomes, right? Or the political alliances that people have, which is strange because that is something we can measure. We can look in the aggregate of who is a part of what party, right? And in general, Donald Trump has never received more than 15% of the black vote. Okay, so is race not a part of our political, like, is there not a racial component to our political process? I'm not saying black people are racist against Donald Trump. I'm saying black people understand the racism of Donald Trump, right? Who can we look at people's race and see if whether they've disproportionately supported one party over another? Do white people disproportionately align themselves with the Republican Party? What do those numbers look like in the Deep South? I would argue that they are still very much racially coded, right? And as much as I do not believe in race, race does not exist, right? They're genetically, every human being is 99.9% identical, right? There is no racial marking, no racial distinction between any of us. There are ethnic distinctions, there are cultural distinctions, but really, at the end of the day, those are just imaginary as well. Not that imaginary things are illusory or non-existent, but that's a different topic for a different time. But yeah, so, like, it is astounding that John Roberts and Samuel Alito and the 4 other white conservatives on the Supreme Court would listen to deliberations often being made by black African Americans, right? Sitting in the same room as Elena Kagan and Ketanji Jackson Brown, and saying with a straight face that there's no racial component whatsoever to allow to this Republican attempt, right? Because it's not the Democrats who are trying to neuter the Voting Rights Act. It is not Democrats who have been working in the last 15 years, right? John Roberts has been doing up to this for like 12 or 15 years. He's gone after the Voting Rights Act many times, usually under the guise of, well, we're just not a racist country anymore. And it's like, well, actually, by the own standards that Alito has set, say that if there are racial components to our political partisanship, then actually we are still racially coded, right? Our politics still are racially coded. And the fact is, the day after the Supreme Court published that decision, states in the Deep South being led by white Republican politicians use this opportunity to immediately try to redraw districts to favor white Republican control of Southern political power, right? And so, again, like, it's so disingenuous for Samuel Alito to say, well, we just need to look past the racial components and not take those into account, despite the fact that it's only white Republicans who feel the sense of grievance that somehow the Voting Rights Act, in acknowledging race, acknowledging the role that race has played in American society, is somehow itself racist, right? As if the people who deny that America has had this racial problem throughout its history, as if they're the ones who've ever made progress. And, like, it's bullshit. You know who's made progress in this country? You know who makes this country great? Are the people who actually recognize that we're not perfect, right? Abraham Lincoln didn't look around the United States to say, oh, well, this is a great situation, right? He didn't say, well, we shouldn't upset we don't want to make the aristocracy, the Southern aristocracy, uncomfortable or feel excluded. We don't want to upset their feelings, right? He's like, you know what? Fuck you guys. We're going to take some guns. We're going to fucking kill you if that's what it takes, right? Because sometimes it's what it takes to free yourself, right? In defense of freedom, it's totally justified. In defense of human enslavement, die, motherfucker. All right, this has been like an hour. I think I got to the points that I wanted to, because what I really just want to do is to make sure that Americans, you know, I'm a patriotic American. I bet that if you're watching this right now, you are too. And it's patriotism to know our history. It is patriotism to see past the moment. I think this is the big problem that we have politically, is that a lot of Americans who should have better judgment are unable, unwilling, ill-equipped to actually hold their political parties, their political affiliations, their political leaders to the account that they should be held to, right? Because it's pointless to attack us liberal Dems and say, stop calling us racist, stop calling us fascist, stop calling us this and that and the other. And it's like, well, I will, just stop acting like racist fascists, right? Like, if you're a bunch of white people insisting that racism is not a problem anymore, and the moment you're told that by somebody in a position of authority, a bunch of white people go out to try to deprive black people of their political representation, why shouldn't I characterize that as racism? And like, if that is what you do, that's the political calculus, right? That's the one motion, setting other things in motion, right? These politics, there are no days in politics, right? Time is not divided into days in politics. Politics is a process that goes across generations, right? Why else would people in the 1920s take up the KKK banner and regalia? They weren't alive in the 1860s, not the ones who were out in the fucking streets Frederick Trump. He's a KKK. His fucking dad was from Germany, Prussia, right? Like, what the fuck did Frederick Trump have to do with the KKK? He's a fucking misinformed dumbass, right? Like, actually, this is another thing. This is what Trump exploits. There is a phenomenon with first generation male Americans who are like trying to assimilate by going way too hard on the prejudice against other Americans who've been here for a fuck ton longer, right? Think about it. If you're white, statistically speaking, you are probably a far more recent immigrant to the United States than anybody who's black, right? Unless you're talking about somebody who's literally come from the continent of Africa within the last 60 years. African Americans can trace their ancestry here in the United States a hell of a lot farther and deeper than the vast majority of white people in the United States. Certainly Donald Trump, right? Like, Donald Trump, the first family member of his to arrive in these United States came in the late 19th century. That was the first, right? And the second and only other one came from Scotland in the 20th century, right? He's barely American by his own definitions. He can barely speak the language, right? He hasn't assimilated. He's an old world motherfucker. He's an aristocratic old world wannabe emperor. He wants to be king. He wants to be lauded as this individual who lords over society. That is the least democratic, least American motherfucking thing in the world. He's old world. He's an old world piece of shit, right? And when he says that they're taking your jobs, that motherfucker took... There are millions of Americans better equipped to be the president of the United States. Some of them are Republicans, right? There are millions and millions of Americans better equipped right? Statistically thinking, there are 340 million Americans. You don't think there are millions of Americans better equipped to be the president of the United States than Donald Trump? But again, if the idea is that it's not about racism, then why is it that white people support Donald Trump and black people don't? Why is it that white people want to insist that this racism doesn't exist, and black people are saying, please don't neuter the rights that we have already, right? When Donald Trump says, what the hell do you have to lose, which is what his campaign was pitching to black voters back in 2016, literally, what the hell do you have to lose? This is what you have to lose. This is what you have to lose. This is what happens when you listen to that man, America. All right, peace.